By the time the last shots of the Russian Civil War faded into silence, somewhere between 7 and 12 million people had perished, more than fell in the entirety of Russia's catastrophic involvement in the First World War. The killing stretched from the frozen Baltic coastline to the Pacific shores of Vladivostok, from the Arctic port of Arkhangelsk to the sun-scorched deserts of Central Asia, consuming entire cities, erasing villages from the map, and leaving behind a landscape so ravaged that travelers in 1921 described provinces where not a single intact roof remained. But how did a country that had just overthrown centuries of autocracy in the name of freedom descend so rapidly into one of the most brutal internal conflicts the modern world had ever seen? And what did it actually feel like to live through it? To understand Russia during the Civil War, you have to understand the speed at which everything collapsed. In February 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated after mass protests and military mutinies in Petrograd. A provisional government took power, promising democratic elections, land reform, and continued participation in the war against Germany. But this government, led first by Prince Georgy Lvov and then by the socialist lawyer Alexander Kerensky, was fundamentally unstable. It shared authority with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies that held enormous grassroots power. For 8 months, Russia existed in a kind of political limbo, two centers of authority, neither fully in control, while soldiers deserted the front in droves, peasants seized land from aristocratic estates, and factories ground to a halt. Then, on the night of October 25, 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party launched an armed insurrection. Within hours, the Winter Palace was taken. Within days, the Bolsheviks declared themselves the new government of Russia, and within weeks, the seeds of civil war had been sown. The Bolsheviks did not inherit a functioning state. They inherited a disintegrating empire. The first major act of the new regime was the Decree on Peace, issued on October 26, which called for an immediate end to the war. The second was the Decree on Land, which formally transferred aristocratic and church lands to peasant communes. These measures were popular in the short term, but they also signaled to every political faction in Russia that the Bolsheviks intended to rule alone. When the long-promised Constituent Assembly finally convened in January 1918, the first democratically elected parliament in Russian history, the Bolsheviks, who had won only about a quarter of the seats, dissolved it by force after a single day. Armed sailors loyal to Lenin simply locked the doors. This was the moment when opposition crystallized. Socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, liberal cadets, monarchist officers, Cossack leaders, and regional nationalists all began to organize against the Bolsheviks. The question was no longer whether there would be armed resistance. The question was how many fronts it would open. If you find yourself drawn into the hidden mechanics of how the Soviet state was actually forged, not the sanitized textbook version, but the raw, complicated human reality, then consider subscribing to this channel. We exist to pull back the curtain on Soviet and Cold War history, to tell the stories that were buried, classified, or simply too messy for easy summary. Join us, and let's keep uncovering what really happened. The Russian Civil War is often described as a conflict between the Reds and the Whites, but this binary is dangerously misleading. It was not one war. It was dozens of overlapping wars, fought simultaneously across the largest country on Earth, involving not two sides but a kaleidoscope of factions with mutually incompatible goals. The Reds were the Bolsheviks and their allies, the New Red Army, organized by Leon Trotsky beginning in early 1918, drawing on a mix of ideologically committed workers, conscripted peasants, and former Imperial Army officers who were either sympathetic to the revolution or who had no other options. The Whites were a loose and fractious coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, monarchist generals like Anton Denikin and Pyotr Wrangel in the south, Admiral Alexander Kolchak in Siberia, Nikolai Yudenich near Petrograd. They agreed on little beyond their opposition to Bolshevism. Some wanted to restore the monarchy, some wanted a liberal republic, some simply wanted to carve out regional power. But the Reds and Whites were far from the only players. Ukraine alone was a battlefield for at least half a dozen competing armies. The Ukrainian People's Republic fought for independence. The anarchist Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, led by the legendary Nestor Makhno, controlled vast swathes of the southern countryside, establishing self-governing communes and fighting Whites, Reds, and Ukrainian nationalists alike at different moments. Makhno's forces, largely peasant partisans mounted on horse-drawn carts called tachankas fitted with machine guns, became one of the most effective guerrilla armies in the entire conflict, and one of the most difficult for historians to categorize. Were they allies of the Bolsheviks? Temporarily, yes. Were they enemies of the Bolsheviks? Ultimately, and fatally, also yes. And then there were the foreign interventions. This is a dimension of the Russian Civil War that is often underestimated in Western accounts but was central to Soviet memory and propaganda for decades afterward. By mid-1918, troops from at least 14 foreign nations were operating on Russian soil. British forces occupied Arkhangelsk and Murmansk in the north. Japanese troops landed in Vladivostok. French and Greek soldiers were stationed in Odessa. American troops, some 13,000 of them, were deployed in both northern Russia and Siberia, ostensibly to guard Allied war supplies and support the Czechoslovak Legion, a force of roughly 40,000 former prisoners of war who had revolted against the Bolsheviks and seized control of long stretches of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Czechoslovak Legion's uprising in May 1918 was, in fact, one of the key triggers that turned sporadic anti-Bolshevik resistance into full-scale civil war. Picture this: a single railway line stretching thousands of miles across Siberia, and suddenly an armed foreign force controls it, cutting the Bolshevik government off from the grain, gold, and manpower of the East. The strategic implications were staggering. What did daily life look like in the midst of all this? The answer depends entirely on where you stood, geographically, socially, and politically. In Moscow and Petrograd, the Bolshevik heartland, the dominant experience was hunger. The Civil War coincided with and directly caused one of the most severe famines in Russian history. The policy known as war communism, implemented from mid-1918, nationalized industry, banned private trade, and most crucially imposed forced grain requisitioning on the peasantry. Squads of armed workers called prodotriadi were dispatched to the countryside to seize grain from villagers. The logic was brutal but straightforward. The cities and the Red Army needed food to survive, and the peasants were the only source. But the peasants who had just received land from the revolution now saw that same revolution sending armed men to take their harvest. The result was catastrophic resistance. Peasants hid grain, slaughtered livestock rather than surrender it, and in many cases took up arms. Across Tambov province, across western Siberia, across the Volga region, massive peasant uprisings erupted, not in support of the whites, but against everyone. Here is a statistic that conveys the scale of the catastrophe. By 1920, Petrograd, the city that had launched the revolution, had lost roughly two-thirds of its population. People fled to the countryside in search of food. Factories stood empty. In the winters of 1918 and 1919, residents burned furniture, floorboards, and books for heating fuel. The water supply failed. Typhus and cholera swept through the city. Maxim Gorky, the famous writer and one of the revolution's most prominent cultural supporters, described the city as a place where people moved like ghosts through streets piled with uncleared snow, their faces gray, their eyes hollow. And this was the capital of the revolution. In the territories controlled by the whites, conditions were often no better and in some ways worse. The white armies, lacking a unified political program, frequently resorted to terror as a substitute for governance. Anti-Jewish pogroms were widespread, particularly in Ukraine, where white forces under Denikin's command and various independent warlords massacred tens of thousands of Jewish civilians. Estimates of Jews killed in pogroms during the Civil War range from 50,000 to over 200,000, depending on the source. Entire shtetls were wiped out. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were systematic, often encouraged by officers who used anti-Semitism as a tool of political mobilization. The white movement's association with pogroms became one of its greatest moral liabilities, and paradoxically drove many Jewish communities toward the Bolsheviks not out of ideological sympathy, but out of sheer survival. The Red Terror, proclaimed officially in September 1918 after an assassination attempt on Lenin by the socialist revolutionary Fanny Kaplan, was the Bolshevik answer to what they perceived as existential threat. Felix Dzerzhinsky's Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, became the instrument of state violence on a scale that stunned even some Bolshevik insiders. Hostages were taken and executed. Suspected class enemies, former nobles, priests, merchants, intellectuals, were arrested en masse. In some cities, Cheka officers carried out executions in basements, shooting prisoners in the back of the head and dumping bodies into rivers or mass graves. The exact number of victims of the Red Terror during the Civil War remains disputed, but credible estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 killed by the Cheka alone between 1918 and 1921. And this does not include combat deaths or famine victims. The terror was not incidental to the Bolshevik war effort, it was structural. Lenin himself, in cables and letters that survived in Soviet archives and were published after the fall of the USSR, repeatedly called for ruthless, exemplary violence, hangings, mass shootings, the burning of rebel villages. The image of Lenin as a gentle intellectual was a post-war myth. The wartime Lenin was a leader who understood that his regime's survival depended on the willingness to use unlimited force. And yet the Reds won. Why? This is one of the central questions of 20th century history, and the answer is not simple. The Whites had significant advantages: experienced officers, foreign support, access to some of Russia's most productive agricultural regions. But they suffered from fatal weaknesses. They were geographically scattered: Kolchak in Siberia, Denikin in the south, Yudenich near the Baltic, and never managed to coordinate a simultaneous offensive. They lacked a coherent political message. The peasants feared that a white victory would mean the return of the landlords. And their dependence on foreign intervention was a double-edged sword. It gave the Bolsheviks a powerful propaganda tool, allowing them to cast the whites as puppets of imperialism. The Reds, by contrast, held the center. Moscow and Petrograd gave them control of the railway hub, the industrial base, and the administrative infrastructure of the former empire. Trotsky, who had no military experience before the revolution, proved to be an extraordinary organizer. He traveled the fronts in an armored train, a mobile command center equipped with a printing press, a telegraph station, and a detachment of elite soldiers, rallying troops, shooting deserters, and imposing discipline through a combination of inspiration and terror. The Red Army grew from a ragtag militia to a force of over 5 million by 1920. Much of this growth was achieved through conscription, and desertion rates were astronomical. By some estimates, over 3 million men deserted the Red Army during the Civil War. But the Bolsheviks had the machinery to conscript faster than men could desert. There is a moment in late 1919 that encapsulates the razor-thin margin of Bolshevik survival. Denikin's volunteer army, surging northward from the Don region, captured Orel, a city less than 250 miles from Moscow. Simultaneously, Yudenich's forces reached the outskirts of Petrograd. For a brief, terrifying window, the Bolshevik regime faced the possibility of losing both capitals. Lenin reportedly considered the possibility of retreating underground and waging guerrilla warfare. But the moment passed. Trotsky personally organized the defense of Petrograd, and the Red Army counterattacked on both fronts. By early 1920, both white offensives had been shattered. Kolchak, captured in Siberia, was executed in Irkutsk in February 1920. Denikin, defeated and demoralized, handed command to Wrangel and went into exile. Wrangel held on in Crimea until November 1920, when the Red Army stormed the Perekop Isthmus in a bloody assault and forced the last major White Army to evacuate by sea. Over 140,000 soldiers and civilians were loaded onto Allied ships and taken to Constantinople, beginning a diaspora that would scatter Russian émigrés across Europe, China, and the Americas. But the end of the White Armies did not mean the end of the war. In many ways, the most devastating phase was just beginning. The Tambov Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising in central Russia led by Alexander Antonov, a socialist revolutionary, erupted in August 1920 and was not fully suppressed until mid-1921. The Bolsheviks deployed regular army units, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of their most talented commanders, to crush the revolt. Tukhachevsky used tactics that foreshadowed the worst atrocities of the 20th century: hostage-taking, the destruction of entire villages, and, according to some accounts, the use of poison gas against peasant fighters hiding in forests. The Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921, when the sailors of the Kronstadt naval base, once among the Bolsheviks' most fervent supporters, revolted against the regime, demanding free elections, freedom of speech, and an end to forced grain requisitioning, was suppressed in a bloody assault across the frozen ice of the Gulf of Finland. The Kronstadt sailors had helped make the revolution. Now they were its victims. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. And beneath all of this, beneath the armies, the politics, the terror, was the famine. The Russian famine of 1921 to 1922, concentrated in the Volga region but spreading far beyond, killed an estimated 5 million people. It was caused by a combination of drought, the disruption of agriculture by years of war, and the devastating effects of grain requisitioning. People ate grass, bark, clay, leather. Reports of cannibalism emerged from multiple provinces and were documented by foreign aid workers, including those from the American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover. Photographs from the famine show skeletal children, corpses stacked like lumber, and markets where, according to some accounts, human flesh was sold. Lenin, facing the total collapse of the economy and the loyalty of the peasantry, finally relented. In March 1921, the 10th Party Congress adopted the new economic policy, or NEP, which replaced forced requisitioning with a tax in kind and permitted limited private trade. It was a retreat, and Lenin acknowledged it as such, but it was a retreat that saved the regime. The Russia that emerged from the Civil War in 1921 and 1922 was a different country, not just politically but demographically, psychologically, and structurally. The old intelligentsia was scattered, dead, exiled, or silenced. The industrial working class, supposedly the vanguard of the revolution, had been decimated by famine, disease, and mobilization. The peasantry, the vast majority of the population, was exhausted and hostile. The Communist Party itself had been transformed by the war. The democratic impulses that had existed within the party in 1917, lively debates, contested elections for party posts, open disagreement, had been replaced by a culture of military discipline, top-down command, and intolerance of dissent. The ban on factions, adopted at the same 10th Congress that introduced NEP, institutionalized this transformation. The Civil War did not just determine who ruled Russia, it determined how Russia would be ruled. Consider this: nearly every major leader of the Soviet Union until Gorbachev was shaped, directly or indirectly, by the Civil War. Stalin served as a political commissar on multiple fronts and developed his networks of loyalty and his instinct for bureaucratic power during these years. His rivalry with Trotsky, which would dominate Soviet politics in the 1920s and end with Trotsky's exile and assassination, was rooted in Civil War disputes over military strategy. Kliment Voroshilov, Semyon Budyonny, and other members of the so-called Tsaritsyn group, Stalin's allies from the defense of what would later be renamed Stalingrad, formed a military political clique that would endure for decades. The Red Army commanders who survived the Civil War would later be consumed by Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 to 1938. Tukhachevsky, shot; Yakir, shot; Uborevich, shot. The Civil War made them, and the system it created eventually destroyed them. The foreign interventions, though militarily inconclusive, left a deep scar on Soviet consciousness. For 70 years, Soviet propaganda cited the intervention of 14 nations as proof that the capitalist world was inherently hostile to socialism. This was not entirely propaganda. The interventions were real, and their intent, while muddled, was broadly anti-Bolshevik, but the memory was weaponized. Every subsequent act of Soviet militarism, every expansion of the security state, every crackdown on dissent could be justified by pointing back to 1918. The world tried to destroy us once, and we must never be vulnerable again. The Civil War became the founding trauma of the Soviet state, the crucible narrative that legitimized everything that followed. And what of the people who lived through it, not the generals or the commissars, but the ordinary Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Central Asians, and others who were swept up in the violence? Their stories are harder to recover. Many left no written records, many died before they could. But fragments survive, in memoirs published during the brief cultural thaw of the 1920s, in letters preserved in provincial archives, in the testimonies collected by foreign journalists and aid workers. A woman in Samara province described watching her children die one by one from starvation in the winter of 1921, their bodies too frozen to bury until spring. A former officer in Denikin's army, writing from exile in Paris, recalled the moment he realized that the cause was lost, not on a battlefield, but in a village where peasants stared at his men with undisguised hatred, seeing not liberators, but just another set of armed strangers who would take their grain and burn their homes. A Jewish shopkeeper in Kiev described surviving 3 separate pogroms by 3 separate armies in a single year, hiding in a cellar while soldiers looted and killed above. These are not abstract historical data points. These are the textures of a world coming apart. The Russian Civil War was not a clean ideological contest between communism and its opponents. It was a maelstrom of hunger, fear, opportunism, idealism, cruelty, and survival. It produced a state that would reshape the 20th century, a state born not in the idealism of October 1917, but in the blood and famine and terror of the years that followed. Every purge, every five-year plan, every secret police operation, every Cold War confrontation carried within it the DNA of the Civil War, the conviction that the regime was surrounded by enemies, that mercy was weakness, that control was survival. When we look at the Soviet Union, its achievements and its horrors, its science and its gulags, its victory over fascism and its crushing of dissent, we are looking at a structure whose foundation was laid not in theory, but in the most violent and desperate years a modern nation has ever endured. The Civil War did not just decide who governed Russia, it decided what kind of governance was possible. And that is a lesson that reaches far beyond Russia, far beyond the 20th century, into any moment where a society fractures, where armed factions claim to speak for the people, and where the cost of victory is measured not in battles won, but in the humanity lost along the way.